When you're drafting your fantasy team, do you ever wish you could handpick the best stars for your business team? If you're building your talent roster, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Don't spend hours on multiple job sites looking for candidates with the right skills when you can do it all with Indeed. Find top talent fast with Indeed's suite of powerful hiring tools like matching, assessments, and virtual interviews. Hate waiting? Indeed's U.S. data shows that over 80% of Indeed employers find quality candidates whose resume on Indeed matches their job description the moment they sponsor a job. And something that I love about Indeed is that it makes hiring all in one place so easy because candidates you invite to apply through Instant Match are 3 times more likely to apply to your job than candidates who only see it in a search, according to U.S. Indeed data. So join over 3 million businesses worldwide using Indeed to hire great talent fast. Indeed knows that when you're growing your own business, you need to make every dollar count. That's why with Indeed, you only pay for quality applications that match your must-have job requirements. Visit Indeed.com/Blue Wire to start hiring now. Just go to Indeed.com/Blue Wire. That's Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Terms and conditions apply. Cost per application pricing not available for everyone. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
Hey everyone, welcome to The Final Four is Not on the Schedule. I'm your host Eric, alongside with expert analyst Rod. Thanks for joining us on the best MSU basketball podcast featuring in-depth recruiting, game matchup, and post-game analysis. We dive deep to give you the best tools to enjoy the Spartans and impress your friends and family. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod. We're here for part 2 of our Big Ten roster extravaganza, we'll call it. There are a lot of teams in the Big Ten, and you know what? It's only going to get worse when we get USC and UCLA as part of the Big Ten next season. So we still have one more season with just 14 teams, and then it'll certainly be 16. And anyway, these series will take a little bit longer, but we had a lot of great discussion, and so we wanted to make sure we kept everything in there for you guys. This is all part of our summer, we'll call it summer, late spring, summer. Although I look outside, it doesn't seem like summer or even anywhere close, but I imagine that'll turn in a little bit. So our summer coverage for Michigan State basketball, again, anything breaking, we'll try and get to you as soon as possible. If we have recruiting news, we suspect there'll be something in the next couple of days and Michigan State recruitment. And then also we're going to get some good interviews with the coaches and other people. So this is part 2 of our show. All right, so let's talk about Michigan, everyone's least favorite team. In some ways, I look at their team, I think, it's going to be huge turnovers. But in some ways, their team is not that different, right? You have Jalen Llewellyn, who was out with the ACL injury early in the season. He returns. Terrace Reed, Doug McDaniel, Terrence Williams, Will Shutter, Jace Howard, Yusef Kayat, and Greg Glenn. Departures: Jet Howard going to the NBA, Kobe Buffkin going to the NBA, Isaiah Barnes and Hunter Dickinson just floating around in the transfer portal. He'll end up somewhere.
And Joey Baker's gone.
Correct.
Too.
Yeah,
I didn't have
Joey.
that on
You're
that
right.
list,
Joey Baker as well is gone. Who knows where Dickinson lands? I think it's highly unlikely he'll be at Michigan. It's the sound of it. Additions for Michigan: Caleb Love coming from North Carolina, Trey Jackson from Seton Hall, Namari Burnett from Alabama, George Washington III, and Papa Conte as high school freshmen coming in. They pretty much have a full roster in some ways, and so it's kind of hard to imagine they're going to add a whole lot more.
Well, yeah, but it isn't necessarily done. There's still a lot in flux.
Right. And so this goes to the point where really things as they seem now are not the same, right? Because last year they brought in Llewellyn, and then the next day, Collins takes off for Arizona State, right? So all sorts of the dominoes can occur.
Yeah. So there's a lot of uncertainty here, but let's start with Dickinson. So as we mentioned, Dickinson hit the portal. We talked about Maryland. He just took an official there. He took one to Georgetown. Apparently he just did a Zoom with Syracuse, but we know Syracuse doesn't have NIL money. So I don't know where that's going to go. He also did an NIL. He did a Zoom with Kentucky. I don't think that's going to happen. That just doesn't make any sense for Kentucky. Might make sense for him in terms of NIL money, but I just don't see Kentucky adding him. But the 800-pound gorilla in this, in my view, is Kansas. And he's supposed to be taking an official to Kansas later this week, if I recall correctly. And if I were betting, I'd bet on him ending up at Kansas for two reasons. One, I think Bill Self, despite the fact that Kansas had a really good season last year, they had to do it unconventionally by his standards. He's normally got size. Bill Self typically has bigs, like real legit bigs. And he didn't have that this year. He had to go with kind of a weird lineup where their center was like 6'7". And I would suspect he probably didn't like that. He didn't like not having that low post option that he could feed the ball into on the blocks. Didn't like not having that physical presence inside. So that's one reason. The second reason is, if you're talking about maxing out NIL, which everything I hear about Hunter Dickinson is that's what he wants to do. There are a few places in the country where you would have an expectation of greater opportunities in that regard than the ones that you would be provided with by Kansas. And so it just makes too much sense to me. Now, you can't rule out that he would come back to Michigan. There are some who have speculated that this entire thing is nothing more than a bluff to get his NIL money increased at Michigan and or to get Juwan Howard to improve the talent around him. Because supposedly the other end of this is he looked at what Michigan was going to have with Howard and with Bufkin gone and said, I can't win here with this. I don't know that I believe all of that. I do know this. If they get him to come back and they get Caleb Love to actually show up, which I'm going to get to in a second, and he plays for them, I will be delighted. That will be the most fun to watch. I've used this line a few times. It's as if Juwan Howard is looking at it and saying, well, you know how last year we had a gunner with no conscience, his son, and another guy who played as if he really didn't care for the first half of the season and forces us to play in one way because he has no versatility, especially defensively. What if we just did the same thing, but more of it? How would that work? Because that's what I see. Caleb Love, I mean, I've seen Caleb Love play for a long time. I saw him play when he was in high school and played AAU. I watched him play against the family once when he was playing for Brad Beal Elite. And I understood why people thought he was a one and done, because he's an immensely impressive guy physically for his position. He's about 6'3". He's physically strong and he is very athletic. I'd say he's in the same general ballpark, in my opinion, as somebody like Akins, maybe slightly less, but very close, just explosive, But the problem is, over 3 years at North Carolina, I think it's been definitively proven he is not a point guard in terms of instinct or temperament. He's a gunner. He's a guy who wants to shoot, and he needs the ball in his hands a lot. And he also brings you the added bonus of, from what I understand, of ripping apart that team's chemistry because he was having a relationship with a teammate's girlfriend last year. So that's what you're welcoming into Ann Arbor. Now, all that presupposes that he actually ends up at Michigan. My understanding is that is not a done deal. And it's not a done deal because Michigan purports to have problems accepting transfer credits. They don't have problems with graduate transfers. So that's why, if you look at most of the guys they brought in the portal era, they've been grad transfers. That's what Mike Smith was. That's what Chauncey Brown was. That's what
Llewellyn was, right?
The kid Llewellyn was, and I'm forgetting the kid the year before that, the point guard who wasn't really a point guard.
Yeah.
And in this year's class, supposedly Namari Burnett fits that category. Trey Jackson fits that category. So those guys aren't problems, but Caleb Love does not fit that. So I have heard that there are questions as to whether they'll actually get him in the door. If they don't, well, it's, they're kind of in a damned if you do, damned if you don't, because they lost so much scoring from that backcourt with Bufkin and Howard gone, that you had to add somebody who can put the ball in the basket. I happen to think that Burnett is a good addition, but he's not proven to be any kind of real scoring threat in college.
Mm-hmm.
He's a very good defender. He's a good role player, but he's not a guy who's likely to go out and get you even 15 a night. Love can do that. The question is the efficiency. I mean, we're talking about a sub 30% 3-point shooter who takes like 5 and change attempts per game. I mean, it's awful. It's awful. So, but they had to add somebody who could go get him a basket. And one thing Caleb Love can do is he can go on hot streaks. He can get his own shot. He can create opportunities for himself, but his efficiency is just horrendous. So it seems to me that the betting is on Michigan staff's part is they can get him to play more efficiently. I am a skeptic on that front. Color me extremely skeptical. And if they do get him and they bring Dickinson back, I mean, I generally watch their games anyway, but I will be glued to the screen watching those games because I cannot imagine a scenario where that doesn't end in complete and total implosion. I just can't see it. I mean, maybe they surprise me, make me eat my words. I don't think so. I think that's a bad combination. Now, if Hunter Dickinson does, as I expect, end up at Kansas, what do they have? Well, right now, they've got Terrace Reed, who I think is going to be a pretty damn good player. And if I were a Michigan fan, I would be kind of excited, actually, about the start of the Terrace Reed era, because I think him playing major minutes at the 5 makes them better defensively at that position right away. I think he can be just as good a rebounder as Dickinson was. Offensively, he's not the player Dickinson is, at least not yet. But I am actually pretty bullish on his future. I think he showed a ton in limited opportunities, a ton of potential at least. And so you start with him. You do have, at least for now, you have Terrence Williams back, who's certainly far from a great player, but he's proven to be capable of being a rotation guy as an undersized 4. You have Shetter, who I was not impressed with.
He's my favorite.
But then you had Trey Jackson, who is an efficient player. He just doesn't do much in volume. He's bounced around. He was at Missouri and then he was at Seton Hall for the last couple of years. This past year, Seton Hall used him primarily as a backup 5. And my sense is that's not really where he belongs. He's more of a 4-man, but he's a guy who's been a high 30s 3-point shooter at 6'10". So he can give you some stretch elements at that position, yet he's big enough that he can probably help you on the boards. I wonder about him defensively, especially if he's got to guard smaller attack-minded 4s. That might be an issue, but a good piece to add. The other interesting thing here, which hasn't yet resolved, despite assurances from many people that it would have already, is they were in the mix for a kid named Olivier Kamua. And Olivier Kamua, if you recognize that name, was a starter at Tennessee last year. He's 6'9", about 240. Not massive stats, but solid stats, solid 3-point shooting, kind of a mid-ish 30s guy, good size. He's a good athlete. The thing that pops in most people's minds is he had a massive game in Tennessee's win over Duke in the NCAA tournament.
Mm-hmm.
I think he had 27 or 28 points.
Yeah.
That game was an outlier. I believe he averaged like 10 a game. his production was pretty similar to like Malik Hall's production this year. So that gives you a sense of what he was over the course of the season. But he can defend. I mean, he can do a lot of things. It's not a guy that I would expect would come in and be an all Big Ten player, but he would be a very savvy kind of addition. Now, the word late last week was that it was pretty much a done deal, but he hasn't committed yet. So I don't know what's going on. I haven't heard about him taking any other visits, but who the hell knows? He was a very hot commodity when he hit the portal. So that would be a very good and a very smart addition for them if they made it. It would instantly make that post group pretty damn solid, in my view. The backcourt, you know, Doug McDaniel showed a lot of potential at the point.
Yep, I agree.
But not a finished product. You don't know yet how much he'll make in the way of strides. And then Caleb Love, we've talked about. George Washington III is a decent recruit, maybe a little better athlete than I thought he was, but I don't know that you're expecting massive immediate impact out of him. And then then you're talking about guys like Jace Howard, Kayat, who didn't play much last year, Glenn, who played even less. I just don't know. And Papa Conte, by the way, their big man incoming freshman, there's been rampant rumors for weeks that he's actually not going to qualify academically. So this is all to say that my point, when you start talking about how it looked like they had a completed roster, there's still a lot of possibility for shifting.
Stay tuned.
Going on. Yeah, absolutely. Stay tuned. I don't think they're done. But when I look at it, you know, my view was if they made the right kind of additions, I could see this team actually being better than they were last year, which, by the way, is not a high bar because they didn't make the tournament.
Yeah.
So it's not a lot to say, oh, you're the 8th best team in the Big Ten and you get a tournament bid, you're better than you were the year before, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's not a high bar. But the reason I felt that way was for all that Dickinson brings you offensively, he's such a bad defender, and more to the point, he forces you to make choices offensively too, but especially defensively, that just limit the way you can play. That I just think having somebody like Reed, who doesn't have to play that way, can do more things defensively. I think that's a bonus. And Burnett is the right kind of addition defensively. You know, Kemwa would be the right kind of addition defensively. You know, so they're adding, or might be able to add, some guys who, you know, could get you to that spot where, yeah, you don't have the scores you had with Dickinson and Buffkin and Howard, but you're better defensively, and you're a more sound team and a less predictable team in terms of how you have to play. So that was my view. Then they went and added Caleb Love. So I have no idea how that makes you better. So I think that's another one that's to be determined. We just don't know yet. I think it's interesting what they've done, but it's not finished yet.
I don't know. I find Howard a little bit like a crow, and I think he sees something shiny and he just kind of goes and snatches it and maybe doesn't really think of the implications.
You don't, you know, he got so much credit that COVID year for, oh, look at these savvy portal additions.
Right.
But it hasn't panned out that way the last 2 years. I mean, Llewellyn, you could say, oh, well, he got hurt, but Llewellyn played a little bit before he got hurt and it wasn't good. And I had said going into the season, I thought there were reasons to be skeptical about the idea of that guy playing point guard. Now, could he help this team in a reserve role? Yeah, he could.
Yeah. Well, we talked about this before. You know, I think, you know, the portal has probably, for as many success stories of portal, there are probably 3 or 4 times as many ones that are failures. And I think you can get fooled. And I think, you know, Mel Tucker is one example. We had got Kenneth Walker and you're like, oh, the portal's the answer. That's going to solve all Michigan State's problems. And, you know, you strike gold. You certainly look like a genius, but more often than not, you've got to have a good foundation, right? And I think what that mix is, and it probably varies from team to team, but you probably can't be all portals at this point and have any sort of level of consistent success.
You make a really good point, and I think that's why it will be important, you know, for all the celebrating and rightly so of a guy like Jerome Tang, what he did at Kansas State with an almost entirely new roster. Let's not forget the guy who meant the most was actually a returnee,
Right.
their point guard, right? He wasn't new. And he's going to have to, presumably, I haven't followed too closely to see everybody they've added, but I would assume with all the roster losses they had, they're going to need to add a bunch of guys again next year. How's that going to look? It's a year-to-year thing. And I think you're right. It's important to be skeptical of the idea of somebody having the magic touch and just being able to go to that well year after year after year and build it that way without any continuity, without any foundation.
Yeah. I mean, you saw Hoiberg do that successfully for a while at Iowa State and then translated into a job at the NBA, and his return to Nebraska, I think you'd say is anything but it's underwhelming. I mean, I guess he sort of looked kind of okay at the end of the season, but that's only because the bar had been set so low that he looked better. Well, let's move on to a team that's been struggling for a couple of years now, a number of years, actually. I can't even think the last time they were really good. Minnesota, the Golden Gophers, they lost a huge departure for them was Jamison Battle, who took off. They also lost Trayton Thompson, Jaden Henley, and Talon Cooper, which, Minnesota losing players is not that big a deal generally, except outside of Battle because they didn't have a lot of great players. They are returning Dawson Garcia, which is nice. Parker Fox, Isaiah Aiden, Farrell Payne, Joshua Joseph, Braden Carrington, Taurus Samuels, and Caden Betts. They added Jack Wilson from Washington State, Mike Mitchell from Pepperdine, and Cam Christie. That last name seems familiar. Cam Christie, the little brother of, why can't I think of his name right now? Max Christie. Max Christie. Boy, it's only been like a year. So Minnesota, Ben Johnson has got to be, he's 1 to 2 years from being on the hot seat, I think, if this team doesn't get better, because they were pretty bad this last year.
It was as we talked about a few times, it was a historically bad team. And, losing your point guard in Cooper and losing Battle is not a great place to be. Yeah. But we'll see. There again, I can't believe their roster is done. But you talk about who's back. So Garcia was actually really productive statistically, and he'll be the power forward. And then they've got an interesting combination of guys inside. Farrell Payne, who I thought was pretty good as a freshman big last year. He showed real potential. He's back. And then they added this kid Wilson from Washington State. And I wasn't overly familiar with him, but when they announced his commitment, I looked into him, and he's giant. He's a huge guy. 6'11", 338 pounds. And he also played football.
No kidding.
So, yeah. So it's interesting. He didn't play a lot last year. He only played in 14 games. But that's at least a physical presence, right?
Yeah.
So I thought that was.
I wonder if he's playing football at Minnesota.
I thought that was an interesting one. But anyway, inside, they're okay. The guy who's really also intriguing to me on this team, you mentioned his name, and probably very few of our listeners have heard of him, is a guy named Parker Fox. And the reason you haven't heard of him is he's been hurt.
Right.
And for the last 2 years, he's been hurt. But he played Division II at a place called Northern State in the 2000, let me see. I believe it was the 2020-2021 season that he played there. So he's missed the last 2 seasons due to injuries. He played 3 years at Northern State, but this was a guy who was a D2 All-American. He shot 64% from the field his last year at Northern State, averaged 22 points, 10 rebounds, 3.5 blocks, and 1.7 steals per game. So big time production, 6'8", athletic enough to play on the wing or inside. So some versatility. I don't know how healthy he's going to be, but they were really excited about this guy when they got him. And I just hope for his sake, he's able to actually play. So that'll be interesting to watch. Their backcourt, losing Cooper was a bit of a blow, but they've got Isaiah Innit, who's also a guy who's missed 2 straight years with injuries, who's a 6'8" wing who had showed some potential under the previous regime. We'll see how healthy he is. Josh Ola-Joseph played a lot of minutes for them last year. And then they added a couple guys. Mike Mitchell, who was a transfer from Pepperdine, and actually had a pretty good year for them. He averaged 11.4 points and 5 assists per game, and he shot 44% from 3. So I think they've got some reason to think that maybe they can actually even be improved at the point. And then Cam Christie, who's a top 150 recruit. Cam Christie can shoot. Now, he's not the overall player. He's not as tall as Max was. Like, he's only about 6'4". But he can shoot, and Minnesota desperately needs shooting. Yeah. So he's got a chance to earn an early role, I think, even though, physically he's got some developing to do. If you saw Max, you know what the deal is with Cam in terms of what's yet to come for him physically. But, look, this is not really saying very much, but I do think Minnesota's got a chance to be better. What does that mean? They could still be, if they were 150 in KenPom overall next year, they'd be substantially improved and they'd still be terrible.
Right.
So I don't know, but there is some talent here. I mean, Dawson Garcia can play.
Yeah, he's good.
He can absolutely play. And, I think that, again, I think Payne showed a lot of potential as a legit big man. But they need a lot more. I don't think they're done in the portal just yet, so we'll see how it shakes out.
Well, let's move on to Nebraska, the team chronically dipping in the portal and with entire roster turnovers practically every season. And yet this season, not quite so much. They're lost Derek Walker, Sam Griesel, Denham Dawson, and Oleg Kognitz. And returning Kisei Tominaga, their sensational Japanese player at the who really came last 10 games of the Big Ten season or so. He really just came alive. Manuel Bandemel, Wilhelm Breidenbach, CJ Wilcher, Jamarcus Lawrence, Jawan Gary, Sam Hoiberg, Blaze Kikita, Karan McPherson, and Rommel Lloyd. They also added Rink Mast, who's a really good player from Bradley, and then Bryce Williams from Charlotte, and recruit Eli Rice, who's inside the top 200.
Yeah, look, I think it's obviously an important year for Fred Hoiberg as he finally got just a little bit of momentum built up last year, and he needs to continue it. The biggest thing is Tominaga, because that guy just proved to be a weapon, and his efficiency improved enough that the things I didn't like about him the year prior was the fact that he just is a completely unpredictable shooter. He takes shots out of rhythm for a normal college player and from bad spots on the floor, but he started hitting them enough that if that continues, we saw there was a stretch late in the season when Nebraska kind of got on their run, so to speak, that he was,
he carried him.
He was a 20-point a night guy. Yeah.
Yeah. He could drop 30 on you in a hurry.
He's capable. And not just a 3-point shooter anymore. He started using the fact that he was a threat from there to his advantage and being able to score inside the arc too. So he's important. Bandemel, who got hurt last year, is back, gives them a nice veteran defensive presence in the backcourt. Wilcher, again, a guy who's played a little bit, can shoot, can score some. I was really impressed late in the season with Jamarcus Lawrence, who was a freshman guard for them last year. So there's some pieces now that they did lose Sam Griesel, which is a big loss. But I think if you look at what they've added, they added the kid Williams from Charlotte as a transfer, and there's some strengths there. This is a guy who shot 40% from 3 and hit 84% of his free throws. So he's a legit shooter. And they can use more of that, So I think that there's a solid addition there in terms of what he may be able to bring to their backcourt. Now, inside, the loss of Derek Walker is a big one.
Yeah, for sure.
Because he was an important guy. But you mentioned Rink Mast, who's a native of the Netherlands, played at Bradley, was a first-team All-Missouri Valley guy last year. And so we're talking about a very legitimate center, 6'9", 240 pounds. So he's got Big Ten size, averaged 14 points, 8 rebounds, 2.4 assists last year. So that sounds a lot like Derek Walker,
Yeah.
who was a playmaking center, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was apparently part of the reason that sold him on going to Nebraska. He picked Nebraska over Iowa. So, and he's also, by the way, he shot 33% over his 3 years at Bradley from 3.
Yeah.
So a little bit of a threat from out there too. So I think he's a good addition. I mentioned Williams as a backcourt addition, but he's really more of a wing because he's 6'7". But otherwise he could maybe help a little bit inside, even potentially in a pinch as a small ball 4. But they have Breedenbach, who was productive at times last year. A big returnee is Juwan Gary, who was starting for them until he got hurt.
Yeah.
The Alabama transfer, he was giving them some really good two-way play at the 4. He's back, as is Blaze Keita, who is another big man who can help in a reserve role. So you look at this team, and I mean, I may really regret saying this, but I think Nebraska's got a chance to be better. The loss of Walker and Griesel is important. Those were 2 very important guys for them, but they look pretty, and by the way, they're also not necessarily done in the transfer portal. So there's a guy who's lurking out there, and it remains to be seen. He's coming on a visit, a guy named Hunter Salas, who's a transfer point guard from Gonzaga, was a McDonald's All-American, never quite cracked through to find his role steadily at Gonzaga. He was in the rotation, but he wasn't able to really make that leap into being as productive as people would assumed. But he's visiting this week. If they get him, that's a guy that, at least in terms of his potential, could really add something they haven't had at the point. I mean, Griesel gave them decent play at that position last year, but Salas would be at least potentially a guy at another level. And if they can add that to this mix we've been talking about, this team got better last year primarily because they got a lot better on the defensive end.
Mm-hmm.
And I see no reason to think that won't continue since so many of these guys are back. If they can get a little better offensively, and adding a guy like Salas could help, getting this big kid in keeps that element in place. Williams may be able to help 3-point shooting. You get another year out of Tominaga. Sam Hoiberg's back too, who was actually pretty good for them late in the season. I mean, I think they were, what were they, 8-12, 9-11 in the league last year?
They were just, they just missed being 500, I think. Yeah, I think.
So 9-11. I think, dare I say it, I think maybe, I could see
it's okay. You can say it. It's okay, Rod.
a little better maybe. And if they can figure out a way to be better in the non-conference, who the hell knows?
They could be a tournament team for sure. I mean,
but I don't want to go that far, but
I will, because
feel okay. You can, but it does feel to me, I look at them in comparison to so many of these other teams, and I think, well, but I know a little bit more about what they're going to be, because there's continuity there, which is crazy to be saying about a Fred Hoiberg team.
Yeah, well, there is.
But there is going to be continuity. So good for them. I think he's finally maybe started to get it in place.
Yeah, I hope so. And, I kind of feel bad for those fans because, I don't really care that much, but they seem to be very passionate and have a fun time. But it'd be nice for them to have a nice product out there. And Tominaga with Guy forces you to guard out to 27 feet, he makes, if you have other pieces around him, you could see them, if they play anywhere like they did at the end of last season, if they start that way, or, there's a potential.
That's it.
Right.
That's
there wasn't a huge difference. It was pretty much, I feel like, the same Northwestern team that came back from last year. yet they were much more successful this year because, on the
Well,
margin.
worse because they lost some guys.
Well, right.
They lost 2 big men starters.
Right. We thought they'd be worse.
And yet they were much better.
Yes.
They were much better. I'm with you.
Yeah. So that would be my bold prediction that Nebraska makes the tournament next year.
And keep in mind, I mean, these things never pan out exactly the way you think they will, but it is worth noting. Nebraska went on their run after they lost Vandemal and Gary to injury. So they were down 2 starters and they got better. And it wasn't because those guys were bad players and it was addition by subtraction. Those were actually 2 reliable guys. It's just everybody else stepped up.
Yeah.
You've got both of those guys back now. I think the defensive improvement is real and sustainable. It's just going to be, can they get a little better offensively?
Mm-hmm.
Can they, does Williams bring them and maybe, if they got in somebody like Salas, get improvement from a couple of other guys? I think, the emergence of Lawrence late in the year as a freshman. Now you've got him coming back as a sophomore with that under his belt. He should be much better. I mean, I can see ways in which they can be better offensively. And if they are, who knows?
Yeah. All right. Let's move to the next, the surprising team this last season, which was Northwestern Wildcats. They had a lot of departures, but they still have some pieces remaining. They still have Ty Berry, Brooks Barnheiser, Matthew Nicholson, Nick Martinelli, and Luke Hunger. They added Jordan Clayton, Blake Barkley, and Parker Strauss from who none of them are highly acclaimed freshmen coming in.
Right.
They lost Titus Verhoeven, Julian Roper, Robbie Barron, and Boo Buie and Chase Adige are both testing the waters with the NBA draft, and I think it's likely at least one of them returns, is my guess.
Well, that's the whole deal. If they get both of those guys back, they can be right back in the tournament mix again. If they don't get either back, it could be a tough year. If they get just one back, better, but challenging.
Better with Buie than probably Chase Adige.
Yeah. I don't see why, unless those guys are just done with college, why they would go, because neither one is likely to be drafted.
Right.
And I just, it's hard for me to, now the downside is, what's the NIL available at Northwestern?
Right, exactly. That's the question.
If those guys were at any other Big Ten school, I'd say almost automatic. Oh yeah. And maybe they don't even go in to test the draft waters, but it's interesting. Sometimes guys are doing 2 things. They're going into the draft, but leaving the option to return, but they're also entering the portal. That hasn't happened with either of these guys, at least not yet.
There's still time,
so,
right? I mean, you could envision that as well.
There's still time.
Yeah.
They could do it before May 11th, but this is one of the bigger unknowns because they're going to be good again defensively with those guys. Offensively, it's always going to be a crapshoot. And they lost Baran to the portal, but late in the season, they were relying more on Barnheiser anyway.
Yeah.
Barnheiser really
was
made
much
a breakthrough
late
in the year. And I think Martinelli showed that he can be part of a good team as well on the rotation. And Matthew Nicholson just was, he was as good as I thought he could ever potentially be coming out of Clarkston. He was really good in the ways they needed him to be. Defensively, he was just a rock. He was a good rebounder, and he gives you enough offensively where you can use him as a lob threat at the rim. He's never going to be a post-up guy, but they didn't need it. They were just so good defensively, and if you get Buie and Adige back, you're going to be very good there again. And then those guys, along with Ty Berry, and maybe improvement from Barnheiser, carry your offense. But it's all depending on those 2 decisions. They get those 2 to break the right way. I think you have to pencil them in as a tournament team again heading into next season. If they don't, they could be back to struggle city.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Struggle bus, right? Yeah.
The NBA playoffs are here, and you can turn crossovers into cash with FanDuel. Just visit FanDuel.com/Blue Wire right now and place a $5 bet, and you'll get an instant $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. FanDuel always has great promotions every single day. It's a safe and secure app, and you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on all the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. Just go to FanDuel.com/Blue Wire and sign up to get $150 in bonus bets when you bet your first $5. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Hope is here. GamblingHelplineMA.org or call 800-327-5050 for 24/7 support in Massachusetts. Call 1-877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY. That's 467-369 in New York. 21 or older and present in select states. FanDuel is offering online sports wagering in Kansas under an agreement with Kansas Star Casino, LLC. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable bonus bets that expire 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit fanduel.com/RG in Colorado, Iowa, Michigan, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Tennessee, Virginia. 1-800-NEXT-STEP or text NEXT-STEP to 53342, Arizona. 1-888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org/chat, Connecticut. 1-800-9-WITH-IT, Indiana. 1-800-522-4700 or visit ksgamblinghelp.com, Kansas. 1-877-770-STOP, Louisiana. Visit mdgamblinghelp.org in Maryland. 1-800-522-4700, Wyoming, or visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net, West Virginia.
Well, listeners, in case you didn't get enough sports today, here's an ad break that'll tell you how to watch even more sports. YouTube is the new home of NFL Sunday Ticket. And if you sign up now, you'll get the lowest full season price of the year. Just go to youtube.com/Spotify offer to get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket. Watch your favorite teams' out-of-market Sunday afternoon games, exclusively on YouTube and YouTube TV. All right, enough about sports. Go get more sports. Terms and embargoes apply. Offer ends June 6th. No refunds.
Next will be Ohio State Buckeyes. Truly the biggest disappointment last season, I think. By far, they were the biggest disappointment.
Yeah.
They kind of turned around a teensy bit at the end of the season, made a little bit of run in the Big Ten tournament, but otherwise, very disappointing season. They're returning Zed Key, who hopefully come with 2 shoulders. Bruce Thornton, Roddy Gale, Felix Okpara, Tanner Holden, Bowen Hardman, and Kalen Etzler. They lost Bryce Sensabaugh, who's going to the NBA, although I guess he could return. Justice Suing, Sean McNeil, Isaac Likely, and Eugene Brown are all gone. They added Dale Bonner from Baylor, Jamison Battle, who we talked about earlier, who's left Minnesota, is signed on with Ohio State. Tayson Chapman is a top 50 recruit. Scotty Middleton, also top 50 recruit. Devin Royal, top 50 recruit. And then Austin Parks.
You know, I've been really, really hard on Chris Holtmann. I have felt that he's been a bit of an underachiever, and last year was the worst example of that. But
great metrics.
I would say, yeah, but I would say from the last week of February till now, it's been nothing but sunshine and rainbows for Chris Holtmann. Because Ohio State legitimately, and I may live to regret this too, but legitimately, I think right now looks no worse than the 3rd best roster in the Big Ten. I think Michigan State and Purdue, at least at the moment, probably look like the 2 best, but Ohio State you put right in there. And that's partially because of the way they closed, which you mentioned. It wasn't just the Big Ten tournament. They were actually better the last couple weeks of the regular season.
Yeah.
And then they rolled into the Big Ten tournament and went on a run to the semifinals from the Wednesday game. So it was impressive. And then the addition, they had a great recruiting class already lined up, and then 2 really nice portal additions. I think Sensabaugh is gone. I would assume it.
Yeah.
And I actually think that's probably for the best, because what's got to happen at Ohio State, offensively, they've been good pretty much every year under Holtmann, but defensively, it's really been a problem. And where I thought they were better the last couple of weeks of the season was on the defensive end. That's got to continue. And Sensabaugh, remember, Sensabaugh was not a factor in that Big Ten tournament run.
Right.
He was out. I think he played the first game, but he was out after that. Or maybe he played the first 2.
Yeah,
but
he missed the Iowa game,
event,
so he missed the second game, yeah.
Right. So I think that they're actually, and he was a very good player offensively as a freshman, but I think they're actually better. This is going to be an interesting team, and health is obviously a factor too. You mentioned Zed Key and the shoulders. If he's back healthy, and there's no reason to think that he won't be, they got a great 1-2 punch in the middle now, because you've got Key, 6'9", proven low post threat, decent rebounder. But I really like the way Felix Okpara, their 6'11" freshman, played when he had to, when they had no other choice but to play him in the absence of Key. I thought he really started to show strides. I think they can be a very good offense defense punch. And Okpara, that's not to say Okpara can't score, but I think he's got the potential to be a rim protector and maybe a little more versatile as a defender, maybe a guy you can do some hedge stuff with on pick and roll defense that you can't do with Zed Key. But that's got the potential to be a pretty good combination inside between those two guys. I thought Bruce Thornton was incredible in that Big Ten tournament run at the point. You know, he'd had a good freshman year, but not a great one up until that point. And then we saw it when they beat Michigan State, right?
Mm-hmm.
He went out and had himself a game.
Yeah, he was good.
I mean, just controlled things for Ohio State. And so he's coming into a sophomore season where he's got to feel like, you know, he can play against anybody. And I think he's got a reason to think that. I thought Roddy Gale showed a lot as a two-way guy in that run down the stretch. The other guys who've got coming back, Tanner Holden was a guy that got a lot of hype as a portal addition, but he didn't do very much. He was actually a good shooter, but he just didn't play much, didn't take many shots. So maybe he finds a way to help, but I actually think more perimeter help is going to come from the new bodies. So Jamison Battle, you mentioned from Minnesota, you could slot him right in at the 4. Starting the season.
Yeah.
I think the question with Jamison Battle is, which one are you getting? Are you getting the guy from 2 years ago who was so good at Minnesota, or are you getting the guy from last year who was banged up pretty much all year, never really found his stride, and wasn't nearly as efficient, wasn't nearly as good a rebounder, just wasn't nearly as good a player? But Jamison Battle, physically right and engaged, is a problem. I mean, that is potentially a major portal addition, you know? So that was a hell of a place to start. And then you look at what they're going to be able to do on the perimeter. So they added Dale Bonner from Baylor, who's a nice backup option to Thornton in a way they really didn't have last year. I mean, he didn't play a ton at Baylor, but I think he averaged 5 points, 3 assists per game. So reason to think that he can be at least a solid option as a backup. And then you got to factor in those wing spots along with Gale. So Gale gives you one option, but they've got 3 freshmen coming in they're very high on. Tayson Chapman, top 40 guy out of Minnesota, very good shooter, 6'4". Scotty Middleton, 6'6", played at Sunrise Christian and was briefly a guy MSU showed interest in, right. Top 50 recruit. Very good wing. And Devin Royal, who I suspect will swing between the 3 and 4, maybe not start it either, but he'll play a lot. He was a guy Michigan State was very serious about. And when they didn't get him, they then went out and got Cohen Carr. I'm happy with that.
Yeah, right.
That trade, but Devin Royal can play. Devin Royal, he reminded me, watching him when he was being recruited by MSU, he reminded me a little bit of someone like Raymar Morgan. You know, he had that size at 6'7" and maybe about 210 or so, where you could see him playing either the 3 or the 4. Not a great athlete, but a good one. Maybe not a great shooter, but a good one. Not a great handle, but a good one. You get my drift.
Yeah.
Devin Royal can do a lot of different things to help you win. And so I really like this team. I mean, they're still going to be on the young side. You know, it's a lot of freshmen and sophomores. And so you never feel great about that. But I like the way that team ended last year. I like their additions, and I think they got a chance to be really good. And he needs them to be good. Chris Holtmann needs a really good year. You miss the NCAA tournament at Ohio State. That's a problem, and it ought to be a problem because that program has resources. It sits in favorable recruiting territory. You've got everything going for you at Ohio State. There's really not a good excuse to not make the tournament. And so coming off that kind of year, he's now going to have expectations because of all the things we've just talked about. He's got to make good on them. I don't know that I think he needs to win the Big Ten, but he needs that team to be really good. And it would help if they make a little run in March too.
Yeah, certainly help for them to be better defensively, which is what they've really been lacking.
That's where it's, and I'm glad you brought that up. That's the biggest thing that has to happen. And so, you're talking about 3 freshmen all playing prominent roles. Battle, who was not a great defensive player at Minnesota, let's be honest. You don't know. Will they be better? But I like the potential of guys like Thornton and Gale and Opara to help make them better.
Yeah.
They do have, and those freshmen, somebody like Devin Royal, he's got a good reputation as a defensive player. Now, how quickly that translates, we'll see. Can they get Battle to be better? We'll see. But there's a lot of talent here. And I do like what they've done. I like the way they look as we sit here in April.
So next, move on to the Penn State Nittany Lions. And I think the best way to envision Penn State is sort of like imagining a nuclear bomb landing in the desert, and it's just turned to glass. And I think that's pretty much explains State College's basketball program. So let's begin with the departures. We have Jalen Pickett, Seth Lundy, Andrew Funk, Miles Dredd, Cameron Winter, Michael Henn, Caleb Dorsey, Dalen Johnson, Evan Mahaffey, Jameel Brown, Kevin Jai, and of course, head coach Micah Shrewsbury, who I don't think anyone predicted was going to be gone after this last year. They have 2 people returning, Kanye Clary and Demetrius Lilly. They added Ace Baldwin from VCU and Nick Kern, also from VCU, as they have the new head coach from VCU, right? Mike Rhodes.
That's right. Well, add in Jameel Brown to the returnees, who's a 6'4" sophomore to be guard. He just announced today he's coming back, so that's 3 returnees. Clary's the important one because Clary actually was in the rotation.
He was pretty good, yeah.
As a backup point guard. Yeah, he showed potential. Brown was actually their highest rated recruit among their perimeter guys, but he only played in 14 games last year. But still, they see him as having potential. Yeah, this is going to be a very interesting situation to watch. We haven't had a chance to really talk about this, but the Micah Shrewsbury story there was just incredibly disappointing to me as a Big Ten fan. I want Michigan State to win the league every year, and that goes without saying. But I've always believed it's in Michigan State's best interest that every team except Michigan in the conference be good, because that gives you an opportunity to be at your best. And I think over the years, that's proven to be the case. I think Michigan State has benefited from the Big Ten being an extremely competitive conference, where by the time you get to March, you've gone through the Big Ten wars, you're ready, so it's been to our benefit to see that.
Yeah.
And I like seeing Northwestern be competitive this year. I'm going to be happy if Fred Hoiberg can find it to keep improving at Nebraska. Every once in a while, it's fun to see the have-nots have a year. And that's what Penn State was last year. That plus their style of play was just a breath of fresh air. I mean, I thought they were a blast to watch. I thought Micah Shrewsbury showed amazing chops as a coach. And then when it came time for Penn State to hold on to a guy who got it done, got him to the tournament, won a game, was very competitive in the game they lost against Texas in the round of 32, and who got to the Big Ten tournament final, by the way. Yeah. They let him walk. They got outbid by Notre Dame, which is a disgrace because Notre Dame is
they're a basketball school, aren't they?
It's a B-list basketball school.
Crazy.
It really is. And I looked at it, and at the time I thought, well, there's no reason in the world, no Big Ten team should ever lose a coach that they want to keep. It should not happen unless you are talking about Kentucky or Kansas or North Carolina or Duke coming after you. That's it. That's where it stops. It shouldn't happen otherwise. But the reality is Penn State didn't want to keep him very badly. They didn't want to pay the freight. And it's not even about salary. My understanding is they were reasonably close to Notre Dame on his salary, but it's all the other stuff. Your NIL program, money available for support staff, all the other resources that go into being a serious basketball program, Penn State was unwilling to do. And so in the end, it really, as I understand it, wasn't much of a choice for Micah Shrewsbury to make. And that's a shame. That's awful. So he's gone. And instead, we have a guy who was supposedly in contention for the job last year, Mike Rhodes, who has done a nice job at VCU. He's a Pennsylvania native, but he's got essentially the bulk of a roster to reassemble. So right now, he has 5 guys on scholarship, 3 returnees and 2 portal additions. Expect Penn State to be active the rest of the
Understatement of the year.
Because he's probably got to add, he's got to add a minimum 5-6 more guys.
Yeah,
right.
Sure.
So
yeah.
It'll be interesting. Now, he continues to recruit some of his former VCU players. The 2 he's got are both VCU players. There's another guy, and let me get his name. Jalen Deloach, who would be nice to add because he's actually kind of a power forward type, who they just had in on a visit, but he just announced today he's kind of opening his recruitment back up, although he's continuing to consider Penn State. That doesn't sound great to me.
No.
If I'm Penn State, but here's the funny part. So in all this dire news, one of those additions, Ace Baldwin, who's a point guard from VCU, was the A-10 player of the year and defensive player of the year.
Wow. So
he got a portal addition who is massive and who was wanted by, name the school. I mean, he was seen as a serious addition. So if there was any semblance of a supporting cast around him, I would be saying, well, maybe Rhodes just got his Jalen Pickett. But right now, you've got him. And I mean, the other kid they added from VCU, Nick Kern, averaged 5 points a game last year. So it's not nothing, but it's not like you look at that and say, well, that's another big timer coming in.
Yeah.
And the 3 returnees, none of them really did very much last year. That's always possible. A few of these guys that left, Mahaffey and Njai, have not yet selected schools. I have no idea if Penn State's continuing to recruit those guys in the portal or not, and what the odds are of getting them back. But sometimes that happens.
Yeah.
That happened with Shrewsbury, as a matter of fact. He had to re-recruit a bunch of guys when he took the job 2 years ago.
Right. And that's without NIL.
He did it.
Yeah.
And those ended up being very significant retentions. So we'll see on Mike Rhodes. I think Ace Baldwin means that they'll at least have a guy at the most important position on the floor who's pretty damn good.
What's really funny about this too is I look at Penn State, and I mean, since they've joined the Big Ten, I would not describe them as a great football program. I mean, they're very, very good. Don't get me wrong, but they're not like dominant, and they're not a great team. I mean, I don't know how they won the Big Ten.
Solid.
For school to focus that heavily on football, a sport that they're
right.
I mean, they were great in the early 90s or 80s, really. I mean, it's been a long time.
70s, 80s, and into the mid 90s.
Yeah, right. So it's been over 25 years. Days. It's like Nebraska,
but
right?
This is.
I understand I understand that's where the fan base are older or whatever. It's cultural, but it is surprising that they focus so much on something that they just don't dominate in. So I guess, and I don't know. I know you have your law degree, but I mean, if you have any eligibility left, you can give Mike Rhodes a call, Rod, and see if he's got a spot for you.
Anybody listening? Yeah. If you want to hit the tryouts at Bryce Jordan, I'm sure they'll have you. It's really unfortunate, I just don't think any Big Ten school has an excuse to operate the way Penn State did.
Not for revenue sports,
thing.
right? It doesn't make any sense.
It's embarrassing. And frankly, it made me wonder, and I had this discussion on the Spartan Mag board. We were fortunate enough there to have a poster, Atlanta 12, who is and he's proven this over time, very plugged in on the television side of athletics. And that gets him a lot of information early. And he actually had pretty good information about this Penn State thing, including that Shrewsbury was likely to go when I just didn't see why. But I didn't know that internally Penn State was having this battle as to how much in the way of resources they wanted to devote to the basketball program. It might be that at a certain point, and we'll see what Mike Rhodes could get done, but it might be that the conference and their peer institutions need to have a discussion with Penn State, the way that reportedly the SEC brass did with some of their schools about starting to devote some of their resources from these massive TV deals into their basketball programs about 5-6 years ago. And it's made a difference in the SEC. And this whole story made me wonder if there needs to be a come to Jesus moment for Penn State.
It could be made for TV, right? Reality show, intervention here with the Penn State.
Yeah, it's just there's no excuse for it. But
yeah,
anyway, we'll see how that roster pans out, and then we can get a better fix on how bad they'll be. But hard to believe they'll be better.
Yeah, that's really hard to imagine they'd make the tournament next year, barring a miracle. So let's move on to the Purdue Boilermakers, the Big Ten champions and Big Ten tournament champions, and colossal collapse in the NCAA tournament where they lost to Fairleigh Dickinson badly. So departures, only a couple, David Jenkins and Brandon Newman. Returning Zach Edey, most likely. I think there's still talk about him possibly going to the draft, 50-50, but I think it's unlikely, right?
Yeah.
Caleb First,
50-50.
Trey Kaufman-Wren, Fletcher Lawyer, Braden Smith, Mason Gillis, Ethan Morton, Brian Waddell, Camden Heide, and Will Berg. So pretty much everybody's back, essentially. Lance Jones, they added a transfer from Southern Illinois, and they have one recruit, Miles Colvin. So this is in some, I want to say it's a little bit like Michigan State, where you have pretty much the starting lineup back. But then Michigan State at least has more recruits coming in. Whereas Purdue's pretty much, basically the same team they're rolling out next year, so as it stands now.
Well, look, we're not going to bury the lead here. The whole thing is Zach Edey. And I honestly, here's the thing: if they get Zach Edey back, the first question I have to ask at that point is, okay, great, what's going to be different?
Yeah, right.
Because they had a spectacular regular season, but we knew, and we talked about it here all year long, their guard play was going to be a question mark. And the fact that as great as he was, Zach Edey locks you into playing one way has potentially negative impacts once you get to March, because you're going to face different types of teams. If you want to go on a deep run, I submit you have to be able to play different ways. And Purdue could not do it. And I'm not sure it's going to be. Zach Edey can't change who he is. He's always going to be 7'4". He's always going to be north of 300 pounds. He's never going to be able to move his feet very well. Those things aren't changing.
Yeah.
I have heard that it's, and not just heard, but the fact that there hasn't been a decision yet would suggest that it's a closer call than maybe people thought it would be. I don't think Zach Edey's not going to be a first rounder. There's no question about that. But it seems to me he'd probably get drafted by somebody in the second round and would have an opportunity, to become a professional. Yeah. One other complicating factor with him, he's Canadian. And what that means is that the NIL route for him is not a simple one. For foreign-born players, it's not the same equation. And I'm not going to bore you with all the details. I do understand that there are workarounds, but that is probably something of a factor here as well, is that how easy or how much in the way of NIL he can get at Purdue is to be determined.
Right.
But if he doesn't come back, then they're a completely different team, right?
Sure.
Just completely different. Yeah. And the interesting thing is, I look at Matt Painter and the things that I've seen him say after the tournament, and he has openly said, we may have to look at how we're playing. He's acknowledged all the things I just said are potentially issues. Now, whether he's saying that for public consumption and he's still going to stick with what's worked for him in the regular season remains to be seen. Sometimes you could fool yourself by saying, well, we just had a bad day. It was bad luck. And sometimes it actually was just bad luck and you had a bad day. Mm-hmm. So I don't know where he's at. I firmly believe they have a problem Now, they could bring this roster back and win the Big Ten next year, and it would shock no one.
Right.
But are they going to be better off in the long run? I don't know.
Yeah.
So the other issue would be the guard play.
I was going to say they have to
and,
be
they
better
have
shooting.
Well, better shooting, and also much stronger with the ball.
Right. Yeah.
They lost their two best athletes, David Jenkins out of eligibility, and Brandon Newman, who opted to transfer. And both of those guys were reserves, but they were playing increasingly important roles later in the year when I think the jig kind of was up with Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
People figured out if we get our bodies into them defensively, these guys are going to struggle to hold on to the ball. And Purdue started coughing up turnovers at a much higher rate than they had previously. And, how much better will those guys be as sophomores? You'd expect improvement, but how much better? I don't know. Ethan Morton is back. So, he's a veteran and he's a little better ball handling option, but he struggles to shoot. They added Lance Jones from Southern Illinois, who's more of an off-ball guy, even though he's 6'1", a decent, not great shooter, kind of a less, well, let's say a pretty reasonable facsimile of David Jenkins, except maybe a little bit less reliable as a shooter. But he's that kind of player. The guy who would really excite me if I were Purdue is Miles Colvin, though. He's only rated like at the back end of the top 100, but I watched Final Four weekend. They had a high school dunk contest that was, to no one's surprise, won by Cohen Carr. But Miles Colvin pushed him.
Yeah, he was good.
He's an explosive athlete, the likes of which Purdue does not usually have. And so having him at like 6'7" on the wing could give them a different look. And in my opinion, different is better for Purdue. Yeah. So I don't know how to feel about this team. I mean, if you bring Edey back, they're right there with anybody in the Big Ten, and there'll be a preseason top 10 choice for sure. And people will expect that those sophomore guards will be improved with a year under their belt. It'll also be interesting to see if they pursue one more addition via the portal. Try to bring in maybe another point guard. That might not be a bad idea. But I just have a hard time getting excited about a rerun of the same deal in terms of what their ultimate potential is.
Right. Yeah. What is going to be different? How you can reset?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I imagine all the Purdue alumni right now are trying to convert their booster dollars into loonies so they can keep Edey around. Well, let's move on then to the second to last team, the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. Everyone's darling until the whole kerfluffle after the incident on campus and the unwillingness to reschedule the game. Then they ended up missing the NCAA tournament. Kind of a implosion at the end of the season for the Scarlet Knights. I think in large part due to the injury to is it Bull? I'm trying to think of his name. He's not on the list here. So anyway, departures: Caleb McConnell, Cliff Omoruye, testing his waters in the NBA. Oscar Palmquist.
You talking about Mawot Mag?
Yeah, Mawot. Yeah, there we go. Mawot Mag. Yeah, thanks. Sorry. I don't know why I see Minute Bowl. I'm not sure. Oscar Palmquist, Jalen Miller, and Dean Reber are the departures. Returning Paul McCahey, who's going to try the draft, but he's probably going to come back. Andre Hyatt, Derek Simpson, Cam Spencer, Mawot Mag, who we mentioned, Antoine Wolfhook. They added Noah Fernandez from UMass, Gavin Griffiths, Babe Ndongo, and Jamichael Davis are new incoming freshmen. So in some ways, it kind of looks a little bit like the same team, but I guess I always feel like it looks similar. When you have someone like McCahey come back, you expect it sort of to run similarly as before.
Well, the big thing here is initially is Omori.
Yeah, right.
If he comes back, and I would kind of expect that, but you never know. He's a force at both ends. And if he doesn't come back, I thought Wolfolk showed some potential inside, but Wolfolk's not going to give you what Omori did, not even close. Mm-hmm. So you take a definite step back if Omuri is gone. If he comes back, then this has the look of a pretty good team again. Here's why. So Mulcahy gives you your point guard, assuming he returns. I thought Derek Simpson looked pretty good toward the end. He got better in his freshman year. Toward the end of last season, he was pretty good. Cam Spencer, sort of rode the rapids. He was great early on, and then teams, I think, kind of figured out that they had to defend him and how to defend him. And he was less efficient, less successful, but he's still a good player to have coming back. So that's a good threesome. But then you add in Noah Fernandez, who's a transfer from UMass. This guy last year, and granted, it's the A10, it's not the Big Ten, but averaged 13.4 points, 4.1 assists per game, shot 45% from three and 48% from the floor. That's a shooter.
They could use some offense for sure.
That is something Rutgers could really, really use. And whether he's starting or coming off the bench, that's a big addition. So now, if you get Cam Spencer maybe back on track, you figure Simpson is better, and he showed some potential as a shooter last year. You add Fernandez, and Mulcahy's always been an efficient shooter. He just doesn't take a lot of jumpers. All of a sudden, Rutgers guards look pretty good as a shooting group. They've got Mag, I assume, back and healthy, and he and Hyatt, when Mag was healthy, was a pretty good 1-2 punch at the 4 spot. I mentioned Woolfolk. If he's your backup 5, I feel really good about that. If he has to start, I feel less good. And then they add a kid, Gavin Griffiths, who's a top 40 recruit, one of the best recruits in Rutgers history, who's a 6'7" forward from New Jersey, kind of an inside-outside threat. That's the kind of player they didn't have on last year's team as an offensive threat. To me, without Omuri, I could still see a way that team could be NCAA tournament worthy. I could see a path, but it's a lot harder.
Yeah.
If they get him back, on paper, that looks like a pretty good team to me. Assuming everybody's healthy, because you have most of your roster back. I mean, really the only important guy you lose is Caleb McConnell, which is not to be dismissed because he was a great defensive player, but you have every reason to think you could be better offensively, maybe significantly.
Sure. Yeah.
And if you have Omuri inside, that's a two-way presence at the 5 that not a lot of teams will match. And with Woolfolk is a pretty good backup. So yeah, it's an NBA decision that I think things are, 2 if you count Mulcahy, that I think things are riding on there.
Yeah, and of course with NIL, like if you're not a guaranteed high contract sort of player, I think these guys are less likely to leave right now. And so, and I guess I don't know what the NIL situation is in Rutgers, but I'm sure it's at least decent enough that makes you pause, whether you just jump into the G League. All right, so let's finish with Wisconsin, the Badgers. This is the classic. The good news is everyone's back. The bad news is everyone's back. So you look, the only departures really is Jordan Davis, who was, okay, I guess. They returned Chucky Hepburn, Tyler Wall, which was a big addition, or I guess return, I should say. Stephen Kroll, Connor Segan, Max Klesmit, Kamari McGee, Carter Gilmore, Isaac Lindsey, Marcus Ilver, Chris Hodges, Jacoby Neath. They added A.J. Starr from St. John's, Noah Reynolds from Wyoming, and a couple of recruits, Gus Yalden, Nolan Winter, and John Blackwell, which, I mean, all said, that seems like way too many players, and so I imagine there's going to be some movement, or some of these players weren't playing much anyway.
Yeah, I think it's more the latter, but this is an interesting team all of a sudden. I mean, it's been a while since I've felt that way about Wisconsin, but earlier in the portal, there were strong rumors that they were going to lose Chucky Hepburn to either Nebraska or Creighton, that he would go home, but that doesn't look very likely now. It seems like he's going to stay. And as you mentioned, they really returned just about everybody of consequence, except for Jordan Davis, who was a reserve. But it's the additions that really should excite you. I mean, Wisconsin last year was a pretty damn good defensive team that just could not score.
Right.
They were a vastly worse version of Michigan State. If they couldn't hit three, whereas with Michigan State, if they didn't hit threes, it would be tough for them to win, but they hit threes more often than not. Wisconsin, if they couldn't hit threes, it was almost impossible for them to win. And they had enough games where they didn't hit them that it was a problem. We'll talk about the returnees first. So Hepburn, you got a point guard going into his junior year, I think has done a lot of good things for them. You have a couple nice options on the wing in a Sejan, who was a really good shooter as a freshman, really the only one they had. Mm-hmm. And then Klesmet, who was a transfer and a very good defensive player. So a couple nice pieces there. And then Tyler Wall, of course, kind of the stereotypical Wisconsin four-man type. Doesn't wow you with anything except his footwork on offense, but he's an effective post player, decent defender, decent rebounder. The only thing he doesn't do at least decently is shoot jumpers.
Yeah.
And then Stephen Kroll, who, struggles to find consistency, but he has his moments. Mm-hmm. And as a 7-footer, he's a legit floor stretching option. He can block some shots. He can rebound. He can also score some in the post. That's a pretty good starting 5. And then you have guys, Kamari McGee was okay as a backup guard. Jacoby Neath, okay as a backup wing. Carter Gilmore, okay as a backup for you. Get where I'm going. It was the bench that I think really didn't add very much for Wisconsin, but that's where the additions are going to change things. And it might not even be just as reserves. So I'll start with the first guy, AJ Storr. And AJ Storr is a guy they think is a major addition on the perimeter. He comes from St. John's, and I'm just pulling up his stats here. So you're talking about a 6'6" guard. That's the first thing. There's real size. There's also some athleticism here. He averaged, the numbers don't knock you out, but he was a Big East all freshman team guy. He averaged 9 points and 2 rebounds per game. He shot 43% overall from the floor, 40% from 3. So those are all important elements. He's not for a team that just struggled to score. Now, the downside is he wasn't considered a great defensive player at St. John's, but I have to be honest with you. Wisconsin is never a team that's built so much around individual defensive ability.
Yeah, it's the
epitome of a team concept with that pack line defensive approach. I suspect that they'll be able to get Storr to be at least passable, and you trade that, even if he's not quite as good on the defensive end, for what he could potentially give to you offensively. He's a guy that I could definitely, those freshman numbers are good. I can definitely see the counting numbers, like the scoring average, taking a jump forward. And he's good enough to press both Klesmet and Asejian for a starting spot on the wing. And then they add another guy in Noah Reynolds from Wyoming, who's a 6'3" guard who averaged 14.5 points and a couple of assists per game last year. So again, what do you have there? Scoring. I think it's easy to see how Wisconsin can be better just from those two additions, that they're going to have more on the perimeter. Inside, they've got a guy who I admit to find kind of fascinating coming in as a freshman, Gus Yalden, who is a borderline top 100 type. When you see this guy, you're going to be shocked that he's got a Big Ten scholarship. And if you're listening, you want to look him up, you'll see what I mean. So he's 6'9". He does not look like a basketball player. He's a bit overweight, not a gifted athlete, but really he kind of reminds me in some ways of a less in shape Jackson Kohler, because he's got great footwork. He knows how to use angles and his size to create space to get shots off around the basket, and he can finish. Now, with Kroll and with Wall, they don't need him to play major minutes, but boy, it would sure help if he's capable, as I think he will be, of maybe giving them 10 decent minutes a night. it'll be better than what they had last year behind Kroll. That's for sure. So I'm interested in him. And then the other guy who is outside the top 150, but I think that may end up being a miss, is from the Detroit area, John Blackwell. John Blackwell is a 6'4" combo guard who played at Birmingham Brother Rice and was really good there, if a little bit under the radar. Never got recruited by either Michigan or Michigan State, but he was very productive. He's very versatile, and he's got bloodlines. His father was a guy named Glenn Blackwell who played at Highland Park when they still had a high school and were very good as a basketball program in the early 80s. And he played at Illinois and was a very good player at Illinois. So the bloodlines are there. He's a guy I think has been overlooked. And so him, in addition to the two transfers, that's 3 new guards that I think could perhaps significantly improve Wisconsin's perimeter depth. So Wisconsin is another team that I would maybe slot in right almost there with Ohio State. It's a different profile. Wisconsin's a lot more experienced, but those are 2 teams that were non-NCAA tournament teams that right now I would be very tempted to put in my preseason top 5 as we sit here on April 17th in the Big Ten, not in the country.
Yeah, right. Sure.
But I think Wisconsin's going to be potentially a lot better, because I don't think they were that far away from being a good team last year. Not a great one, but they weren't that far away from being good. They basically needed to find a little more offense. Well, I think they've added that.
Yeah. Well, and you look at their NCAA tournament, they're probably 1 win away had they not lost to Ohio State.
Right.
They might have been in the tournament, and we'd look at them differently than this season than probably.
Absolutely. And so to me, I mean, they're even in some ways, they're a safer projection than Ohio State, just because they're so much back.
Yeah, they're so close.
And it's a lot of juniors and seniors, as opposed to, freshmen and sophomores that you're counting on.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. And until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go Green.
You heard it in the song. If you like fantasy sports and sarcasm, the Razzball Fantasy Baseball Podcast is the place for you. Gray Albright and myself, Beat On, bring you all the info you need once a week to help you win your leagues.